Okay? By now you learn not just to memorize meanings of words, but to figure them out when you see them. And that word superjective, Latin jaccio, is the verb to throw, to cast. Super, over, on. Yeah. So that it's in the superjective nature of God that God, as it were, gives something to nature, to the world. But the consequent nature of God, God gets something from the world. You see? So you have to start with the primordial nature of God to know, as it were, what God begins with and how an event affects God, and then what God gives back to the event. Because that's the way it is. You see, what's everlasting is the primordial nature of God. That never changes. That never changes. Consequent nature, superjective nature, those are changing. But the primordial nature never changes. What is the primordial nature? It is the ordered harmony of all eternal objects. Eternal objects are the eternal possibilities. In other words, what he's saying is that you have to think of God as the sum total of all logical possibilities. Now, get that in mind, and then see how it echoes the past. For St. Augustine, the rationes aeternae, those eternal forms, eternal ideals, Plato's forms, are what? They're conceptual possibilities in the mind of God, archetypes in the mind of God. Sure, that's what Augustine got from those Alexandrian church fathers. From that Logos tradition in the early church that was so influenced by the Middle Platonism. And you remember, of the three influences on Whitehead's thought that we were talking about last time, the third was these Alexandrian church fathers. So in effect, what Whitehead is doing is picking up on the Platonic theory of forms as it was translated through the Middle Platonism into the Logos language of the Stoics that the Christian church adopted and applied to the Creator God and the incarnate Logos, in whom are hid all treasures of wisdom and knowledge, yes, all rationes aeternae, all forms. That's the way they explained his omniscience. You see. That's the way it was in the Alexandrian tradition, in Justin Martyr, in Augustine, in Anselm, in Thomas Aquinas, the whole medieval tradition. You see, but it's back to the Alexandrians that Whitehead likes to go. So then, you have, in thinking of God and God's experience, God's own experience, you have to think of his thinking on these thoughts, his eternal wisdom, the possibilities for his creation. Now, as nature itself, the world, and the world's history, development takes place. Natural events, God, who is all experiencing, experiences the world. And he can be touched with the feeling of what's going on in the world. You see? So God feels what's going on. God's don't move him. You see? God feels with us. That's the language that Whitehead keeps using. I'll read some of it to you shortly. You see? So that there is then here the conceptual prehension of possibilities. Here there is what he has called the physical prehension of objective data, of what's going on. You see? And God experiencing in that very affective sense what's going on in the world, while knowing conceptually all sorts of eternal possibilities for harmonizing, what does he do? In his subjective nature, he offers possibilities to the world process. Yeah, it's God who provides the initial subjective aim. God, not some blind mechanistic force, but God. You see. And, of course, in human experience, you begin to see now that human beings have freedom to resist the will of God. You see. Freedom to modify what God in his goodness offers as an aim, purpose. So God's primordial nature corresponds to the second ingredient in a natural event. God's consequent nature corresponds to the first ingredient in a natural event. God's subjective nature corresponds with the third. That is to say, the third which then leads on into future events as it does. So that as the next event comes down the pipeline, as it were, hideous metaphor, the primordial nature of God incorporates all possibilities for this new situation. You see? Yes, because the total possibilities included the possibilities that would arise in any new situation. So the primordial nature is always there with things in reserve. Now, I said the next event that comes down the pipeline. Of course, it's not a matter of events coming down. Beep. Watch it, here comes another one. Beep. No, it's not that way. It's much more like a, well, I suppose you have to say, since I used sounds, some extremely complex but magnificent symphony. You see. Or if you want to use strands, it's more like a highly complex Bell telephone cable that takes them a week to sort out when it gets messed up. You see, with events weaving into events, in multitudinous lines of connection. But for simplicity's sake, he analyzes it in terms of one event leading to another event. So what sort of God, then, does this give? Well, it's a God who orders the universe. God, he says, is the principle of order. Or, to use his term, God is the principle of concretion. Now, you look at that word concretion, and I suppose you think concrete. No, don't. Never take his words at face value, his technical terms. Concretion seems to be his synonym for the word concrescence. And if you have Latin, and if you don't, it's still the case, that the word concrescence means growing together. Cresco is the verb to grow. Con, with, growing together. There used to be a cooking fat called Cresco. Until in these days of fat consciousness, they all became liquid rather than solid. Cresco was a cooking fat that makes the cakes rise. So, concrescence. Now, God then is the principle of concretion, concrescence. It's God who keeps the growth going into that harmony of the symphony. Now, notice, God does not originate the world process. God doesn't originate it. The category of the ultimate is creativity. There's always been creativity. Primary example is God. But Whitehead seems to think that there are natural processes that have been going on, one or another, going all the way back. You see, and there's no reason in Whitehead to think that God was the first such process. So I guess God and the Big Bang, title of a lecture tomorrow night, I see, would be very different for a Whiteheadian theologian than for a traditional theist. You see. Nor does he think of God, he doesn't think of him as an originator, nor does he think of him as God who is the terminator. I guess that's a science fiction term now. God is wrapping it up. In other words, he doesn't have an eschatology. You see, he doesn't have an eschatology. The end of the thing. You say a teleology without an eschatology, yeah. The teleology just goes on and on and on and on and on. And then on. So the harmony is being created all the time. And it's an everlasting harmony. You see? Yeah. It's an everlasting harmony. So he doesn't think of history having some terminus towards which it's moving. God is the principle of concretion, the principle of order. He also calls God the principle of limitation. Because by virtue of his superjective nature, there are only limited possibilities available. Only limited possibilities available. So the world process is not going to self-destruct for Whitehead. It couldn't, if that's not in the possibilities. God's subjective nature